Good morning, everybody, and welcome, and especially welcome to John Woodland, who is joining us from Cape Town. John is the founder and director of the wonderful VOX Chamber Choir. And I think a lot of us here this morning participated in last week's Zoom session with Michael Barrett on what makes a great choir. And Michael comes from a different angle from John in that he studied choir music, choral directing at university as part of his BMAS and then for his master's and doctorate, whereas John's doctorate is in chemical biology and he works in that line full-time at UCT. He came to choral music, choral directing from being an organist while at school, went on to conduct the University of Cape Town choir. And in that sense, there's a similarity between the two of them because they have both worked with university choirs. But then John moved on to the St. George's Singers with the very well-known Barry Smith at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. And when Barry Smith retired, after a brief hiatus, he started VOX, and they have gone from strength to strength ever since, and they really do wonderful performances. Thank you for joining us, John, and we very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you for the kind invitation and introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've titled this presentation, or paraphrased, I guess, from the subtitle to Tolkien's The Hobbit, There and Back Again, because it's really been quite a journey over the last year as an ensemble that has focused on live performance to have to adapt our work to lockdown projects, these virtual performances. And now we're having to emerge from our computer screens and think about coming together in person again. So that's really the sort of narrative of this morning's talk. But just before we begin, I thought I would share this little, what we call a meme with you. You might have seen something like this before. Just the many roles that not only a choir director, but anyone who's involved with running a choir has to deal with. And these roles have become even more diverse and perhaps important over the last year. They've really had to span sort of leader, motivator, musician, all the way to therapist, treasurer, imagineer, motivator. It's been an unusual challenge, a privilege over the last year to lead my group of singers, but it's also been very difficult as well. But I hope that I'll be able to share with you how it's also been a very fulfilling musical journey, as well as one of personal growth for not only for me, but I hope for my musicians as well. So what I hope to do today is just to share with you VOX, what is VOX and its musical vision, share some of the favorites live performances that we've given with VOX over the last 5 years or so, how we really tried to make the most of the lockdown period, not only for our singers, but for our larger musical community as well. And then to share with you some reflections, and in between also a few recordings, both real recordings when we could still come together in person and those that we've made during lockdown. So to start with a little bit of a spoiler, it's hard to believe that it's been almost exactly a year since we went into lockdown. How naive we were maybe to think that, oh, just after 3 weeks or 5 weeks, it would be life back to normal. But I think actually today, the 15th of March, exactly a year ago, was the first announcement by the president that we were going to introduce strict measures as a country to curb the spread of the novel coronavirus. And a few days after that announcement came the announcement of the lockdown, which of course had a devastating impact or implication for the arts, at least, and in particular for musicians and choral singers, people who rely on coming together to make their music. And it's very strange to reflect really over a period of 3 weeks. This is a photo from our last live performance in February last year, that just about 3 weeks later, we'd all be stuck at home in our little Zoom boxes and suddenly, from a very intimate form of music making, have to grapple with coming together now over a long distance and in a very different kind of way of expressing ourselves and making music. But fortunately, my singers were very enthusiastic, willing to come together, experiment, give things a shot. So we immediately thought at the beginning of lockdown, well, it's worked so well for Eric Whittaker, who's a contemporary American composer, this idea of a virtual choir where everyone is at home, records their individual parts, sends them through to us, and then we stitch them all together to form the rich musical tapestry. Let's do something like this, although not quite as elaborate as what Eric Whittaker's done, but just a small way of reaching out to our community, our audience, to say, look, we're still here, we're trying our best, and wishing you comfort and hope during this difficult time. So I thought I'd start this presentation just with our very first virtual choir project that we put together, our first experiment from April last year. And it's a setting of a motet by Thomas Tallis, an English Renaissance composer, called If Ye Love Me. And this is quite a special piece for us. It's sort of our go-to piece as VOX, and it's also our audition piece. And we thought it was an appropriate way just to sort of set the tone at the beginning of what would be quite a strange and challenging adventure for all of us. If ye love me, keep my So that was our first foray as VOX into this brave new world, I guess, of virtual choir projects and singing together while apart. So maybe to go back to the beginning, the very beginning, and just put VOX in context, and thank you, Caroline, for very nice introduction earlier. But this is a photo from January last year from the Baxter Concert Hall, from the UCT Summer School series. And these are presented, at least the musical components, every year by Barry Smith, who is a very important musical figure and mentor for me. And after working with the UCT choir for some years and deciding it was then time to sort of hand over to fresh blood, because back then it was entirely a student-run ensemble, I joined the St. George's Singers with Barry Smith. And perhaps a bit of a regret is that I didn't have more time in the ensemble with Barry, because it was only after a couple of years that he decided he was going to retire, hang up his conductor's baton, and approached me and asked whether I'd be willing to take over the ensemble, and thought a little bit about it and decided that maybe what would be a better approach, because the St. George's Singers was so much Barry's choir and his vehicle for music making, if we perhaps wrap that up, take a little break, and those who are interested in joining a similar but different group with a distinct musical vision could then sign up for what would become VOX, And then that would really continue the legacy of Barry St. George's singers and the amazing musical events, the oratorios, the choral works he presented for Cape Town's musical scene, but with a slightly different aim or focus. So we came together then a few months after the St. George's Singers wrapped up, and here is the first cohort of singers who joined VOX in, well, 2015, but we needed a few months just to sort of find our feet, and it was only 2016 that we presented our first performance, and this is the final rehearsal before that performance. And we had spent those few months also articulating our musical vision, which is dynamic. It does sort of change, but really the core aims remain the same. And I hope you will see how these aims become themes through the presentation as I share with you some of the performances we've given over the years. So the primary musical focus for VOX is to create mesmerizing, multisensory, these immersive, imaginative choral experiences, not only for our singers, but of course for our audiences as well. We're also very passionate about developing new audiences for choral music by performing new or seldom heard repertoire in unconventional spaces. So that's, again, a core focus of what we do is unusual music in unusual spaces. We also try to support local composers by commissioning and recording new music, and also helping our singers with their musical development by hosting workshops with vocal and performance specialists. And then lastly, to promote choral music at home and further afield by setting down and disseminating new recordings. And we're fortunate to enjoy some really great relationships with a local recording studio, Cape Town Sound, and also Fine Music Radio, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with as the community classical and jazz station here in Cape Town. And to ensure the sustainability of VOX and to make us accountable to our members, we've registered as a non-profit organization, and we now have approved PBO fiscal status, which means that we can really devote our resources to fulfilling this musical vision of ours. So our first performance was trying to tick many of those boxes that I've just mentioned. And this performance then in September 2016 was called A Tale of Two Taverners. It juxtaposed the music of two composers who share the same name, John Tavener, but separated about 500 years in musical history. So there was an English Renaissance composer called John Tavener, a contemporary of someone like Tallis, whom we heard just a few minutes ago. And then there's a so-called holy minimalist, John Tavener, of the late 20th century, who has become quite popular, and his piece Song for Athene was performed at Princess Diana's funeral. And that's not music one hears in Cape Town very often. And we started also with this concert experimenting with aspects of lighting and staging. We sang an 11-part reduction of Tallis's enormous motet Spem and Alium, in which the singers stood in a circle. So that created a really cohesive sort of ensemble, and also a different singing experience for the singers, because one normally faces the audience. And so in this way, we sort of had to overcome a challenge maybe of now some singers having their backs to the audience, but this unusual sense of ensemble that's created with having the singers now almost singing to one another instead. Shortly after that, we embarked on a sort of series of concerts that explored contemporary choral repertoire. And one of these concerts that was held in the Memorial Chapel in Bishop's, my alma mater, because it's got this wonderful cathedral-like acoustic, was called Trust the Silences. This was a celebration of contemporary choral music, mainly by Eric Whittaker, whom I mentioned earlier. He's quite popular at the moment. And we called this performance, which also had a sequel, Trust the Silences once more, Trust the Silences, because this was taken from an inscription on one of the scores of Eric Whittaker's pieces, a piece of music called When David Heard. And he suggests to the choir, when they perform this work, above all, trust the silences. And that's because there are many poignant moments of silence in this performance. And it's a reminder how the silence is as much a part of the music as the pitched and sung notes themselves. You also can see this tree motif that became an important part of how we structure our concerts. We like to have motifs and artwork that create the sense of a complete immersive musical experience. In other words, the performance should align with the venue, the music, the artwork, the marketing, the posters, all of that. And we commissioned one of our artistic team to create the special tree motif, which, as you can see, is quite sort of classical and flowing on the one side, but then edgy, contemporary, a bit severe on the other. And that was also kind of a representation of what we were hoping to do with this concert, this juxtaposition of classical but contemporary approaches to choral music. We then went on a voyage to the Northern Lights to explore music from the Baltic region, Gorecki from Poland, Stravinsky from Russia, composers from Latvia, Arvo Pärt from Estonia, from Scandinavia as well. And for this performance, Kyle Paulson, who is our manager, also my partner, he created this amazing seascape, this impression of a ship on the stage here at St. Andrew's Church where we perform. Hopefully you can also hear in the background the creaking sails and the wind. That was the sound that was playing as people entered the church. They were then invited to have a cup of glühwein and settle down for this voyage to the Northern Lights. One of the other things we've tried to do to tick this box, I suppose, of multi-sensory experiences, not just in terms of the eyes and the ears, but, well, why not sense of taste as well, is Vinnie Choral. It's a pairing of wine and choral music that we've now hosted 3 installments of at Groot Constantia. They've been fantastic partners. And what we try to do here is pair wine with music. The wine is introduced by an estate wine specialist. Rodney Trudgeon from FMR introduces the music. And we try to find music that pairs up with certain characteristics of the wine. And we try to make this a bit democratic as well and sociable. So we as VOX go off for a tasting to Groot Constantia and then have a discussion about what music we think from our repertoire best complements the wine that we are tasting and enjoying together. And so this is one form of sort of unusual music making that we found has been very successful and again has introduced people to choral music who might not otherwise have attended a live choral performance. And just to maybe share with you some of the lines from our marketing materials, just to give you a more vivid sense of what this would involve. Savor 7 Groot Constantia wines, ranging from the Cup Classique to whites and reds, and ending with the famous Grand Constance, not typically available for tasting, as described in novels by Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. Enjoy 11 pieces of choral music, from madrigals and folk songs to contemporary music from Norway, Poland, and the USA. And then, yes, hosted by Rodney Trudgeon of FMR in the cozy candlelit atmosphere of the Groot Constantia tasting room. We also perform with other ensembles. We don't sing entirely a cappella. And here are some shots from another candlelit performance, this time with Camerata Tinta Barocca, the early music orchestra here in Cape Town under the direction of Erik Dippenaar. And I have for you just a short rehearsal clip, just to give you a taste of VOX with a few instruments, not the whole orchestra, just continuo in this case. But again, back in that time when we could stand and sing together maskless. So just a short clip there with Erik Dippenaar, a rehearsal in preparation for the Baroque Festival. That was a chorus from Purcell's King Arthur. Another large performance we've given, I guess our largest yet, was in St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. We teamed up with 2 other choirs, Stadskoor Tegenberg and the Cantique Chamber Choir, for the Stabat Mater by Carl Jenkins. Again, a contemporary composer, and this is a really great work, because what he's done is fused aspects of Western and Middle Eastern music traditions in this text that's traditionally associated with Good Friday and Easter, and he uses these unusual modes and instruments, and it's a very, like a lot of Jenkins's music, very accessible and appealing, and so this was a great challenge for us, from normally singing in more intimate spaces to suddenly a very large space and all the logistical challenges associated with that. But it's very exciting to be able to reach and share our music with such a large audience. I mentioned a bit earlier that performing, commissioning new choral music is also an important aspect of our musical vision. So here are just some examples of different pieces, styles, composers, texts, which we have either set to music, commissioned set to music, or given first performances of. And in particular, the 9 lessons and carols that we host every year, 2 live services, and then also a broadcast on FMR, because of the nature of that service, that really works very well for exploring not only favorites and carols, but also introducing audiences to new music, or music composed closer to home than a lot of the traditional King's College, Cambridge Christmas repertoire. And so what I'd like to do now is just share a recording with you of a new piece of music, of which we gave the first performance, by Stephen Carletti, who is a teacher in voice and composition here in Cape Town. And it's a piece of music called Bye Bye Lullaby. It's a setting of a Renaissance text in which Mary is comforting her newborn, and you'll hear it has a very tranquil and almost dreamy atmosphere. And so this, again, was a recording. This is now, I suppose, yes, besides that little rehearsal clip we heard, a recording of VOX together in person, and not a virtual performance. Oh, sorry about that. Bye Bye Lullaby, a new carol composed by Stephen Carletti. Moving back to vast spaces for performance, and perhaps one of the most challenging performances I've ever had to give was in the Norval Foundation, that wonderful new gallery space in Steenberg. and you can see that in the bottom panel there. And we were expecting this cathedral-like space to perform, only to discover a few days before the performance that, in fact, an installation artwork had been prepared and installed there with Hessian sacking covering every surface of the gallery. And so it created, instead of this very wet cathedral-like acoustic, a very dry and almost harsh acoustic, which was very difficult for us to adapt to sort of so quickly. And we were performing some fairly complex music by composers like Philip Glass. So that was quite an unexpected challenge. But nevertheless, despite those challenges, each performance always still then has its own special sort of character. And something we experimented with for this particular performance, those top panels of this slide, was the idea of an open rehearsal and a preview performance. And because this Norval concert could only accommodate a limited audience and was quite expensive in terms of the ticket prices, we thought, well, why not open up our rehearsal process for those who are keen to come and see how VOX rehearses, what happens behind the scenes. And then if they like, they can stay on and listen to what for us then is a very relaxed sing through of the music ahead of the actual performance. And I was really astounded when we had about 200 people coming to this first open rehearsal preview performance in anticipation of this Norval concert, which was quite a revelation to me, made me realize that perhaps there is an appetite and interest in seeing what goes on behind the scenes in the rehearsal. So those are sorts of things we try to do at least then twice a year, just to make our music, again, more open and accessible to those who are interested either in other aspects of choral music or maybe can't always afford coming to all of our performances. A more intimate setting was the UCT Irma Stern Museum, where we performed a series of recitals a couple of years ago. And again, this idea of creating immersive musical experiences that tie up both the music and the performance venue, but also aspects of programming and artwork. We sang Benjamin Britten's Flower Songs, and you'll notice each of the singers has one of these disers, paper origami disers pinned on their chests. These artworks were specially prepared by a colleague, and really then just linking us here to Cape Town, to our unique flora in this region. And there was an important musical theme in the program as well. And maybe just to share with you one more unusual aspect of a performance we've put together. This was a concert called VOX Pops, in which we encouraged our audience to go online before the concert, to go to a Google form where they could choose what music they wanted to listen to, either pieces from our existing repertoire or new pieces of music that they might want to hear. And we received, again, a tremendous response, and it was quite exciting for us, rather than us imposing a musical program on the audience, but have them make suggestions and say what they would like to listen to. And what was also interesting here was just the number of our audience who said, no, we actually don't want to interfere with your music preparation process. You must just decide, and we will sort of lap up whatever you're willing to share with us. So that was another interesting aspect of preparing a performance. I'm not now going to go into the outreach work we've done. We're very passionate about other aspects of our community. We have close relationships with various churches and retirement villages and some schools. But just to honor our patron and I guess the person who inspired the founding of VOX, Barry Smith, we put together a little party for him for his 80th birthday the year before last. And gosh, 85 is coming up so soon. We're going to have to get organizing the next celebration quite soon. But then this was the start of 2020 to kind of bring us back up to the present. You can see everyone enthusiastic, full of beans for what would lie ahead in the year. And we started off with some performances in the dark. This is a series of recitals we give at the Young Blood Gallery in Cape Town. And for this particular performance, it was a journey of music spanning at least 1,000 years, all the way from early plain song right up to contemporary polyphony, some works that had just been composed a few years ago. And this is always a very special way of making music for us, like that very first performance I shared with you, where we all stand in a circle and essentially sing to one another. That we do on the mezzanine level of the gallery, with the sound cascading down to the audience below. They're in darkness or wearing blindfolds. We, of course, need light to read our scores. But these are just some of my most favorite pictures of listeners, appreciators of music who are just lost in the sound. And some just with their eyes closed or with the blindfolds they're invited to wear for these in the dark recitals. And then lockdown. And now from an ensemble that had so focused on live performance and that very tangible, multi-sensory connection with the audience, we had to find new ways of connecting with one another, of connecting with our audience. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, this immediately started with experimenting with virtual choirs, steep learning curve for all of us, all the minutiae, the details of recording things at home, click tracks to align everybody, distortion if someone is standing too close to a microphone, bringing all of that together to form the kinds of virtual performances that you heard at the very beginning of this talk. It wasn't all bad or difficult or too much of a challenge. I mean, here you can see some singers really rising to this challenge and some of the wonderful feedback we received, not to want to blow our own trumpet, but just to demonstrate how for some during the difficult time, especially the first few weeks of lockdown, this music really had quite an impact on them. And it was a very special way for us to be able to connect then with our audiences. These kinds of projects also allowed us to do things we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. For example, we did a virtual choir project with the Cape Philharmonic Orchestra. And this is something we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise because we are a small ensemble. We would just be drowned out by their sound. But when one is doing this virtually, you can, as with a recording, play with the levels to sort out the balance between the singing and the orchestra. So I'd like to play for you that little project for you now. It's called The Seal Lullaby. It's by, again, Eric Whittaker, one of our favorite composers as VOX. But we thought this was appropriate for several reasons. It's all about a mother seal singing to her pup. And of course, as Cape Townians, we're very familiar with seals. The words are written by Rudyard Kipling, who spent some time in the Cape. And importantly, the words, "Hush thee, my baby, the night is behind us." This project came just after the major first wave of infections had passed. And so it felt like an appropriate sort of sense of comfort, hope. We are still together during this time. And I'd like to play that for you now. We'll be back on stage soon. Wonderful underwater footage that was included in that recording of the Seal Lullaby by Eric Whittaker that we produced with the Cape Philharmonic Orchestra in about September last year. So besides these virtual choir type projects, what were other ways in which we attempted to come together as singers and to engage with our audience and our musical community? Well, we still had weekly Zoom meetings for our singers, and those took the form of either working on these virtual online projects or even curated listening sessions. We could listen to music together, self-care, even sometimes yoga sessions for those who wanted to lead them, but also workshops with, you'll see a screenshot there at the bottom with Veta Wise, who is quite well known here, has been involved with Cape Town Opera. She's based in the UK, and we might not otherwise have had a workshop with her. But now with Zoom, it's so easy for her just to lead us through a session, reminding us of our physiology and singing and connecting with our voices. We might feel quite lonely and almost sort of stifled behind our computer microphones. We put together the virtual VOX performances that I have been mentioning. We've heard two of them, the one by Thomas Tallis and that Seal Lullaby. We also released some previously unreleased live recordings of our concerts. I mentioned that concert in the Norval Foundation. We had a recording made of that. And so this break from live performances almost gave us a chance then to delve into our archives, see what material we did have, that we could then spend a little bit of time cleaning up and mastering and sharing it at no cost on YouTube and saying to our audience, look, we can't be there for you in person, but if you want to go onto YouTube and click on this playlist, you can close your eyes and almost imagine that you're in this performance with us. We also put together a birthday broadcast on Fine Music Radio. Last year, VOX turned 5. And so part of our plans is always to have a big sort of celebratory performance for the 5-year mark. We had one of our singers design this really cool motif you can see in the top left-hand corner, integrating all the motifs and symbols from our various concerts. You can see the disers and the ship from the Northern Lights and the wine glass from Vinnie Choral. But instead of having a live performance, we did the next best thing, which was have a radio broadcast, which you can then see in the top right-hand corner. And not only did we have a Zoom session running with our singers where we could then have dialogue and reminisce, but we could share this music, and some of our important collaborators sent through voice notes, and we could share those on the program. We could share all of this with a much wider audience all over the world. And then lastly, we did a recording at the end of 2019, and lockdown gave us a chance to really delve into the studio, into those recordings of Barrels and Blossoms. We called the CD. It was a combination of our Vinnie Choral, hence the Barrels, and our Flower Songs at the Ermistone Museum, hence the Blossoms concerts. And we were able to produce a physical CD and then made a great effort to really connect with our audience, to hand deliver to our most loyal supporters copies of this disc as something tangible to connect with them during this time of distance and staying at home. And what was most exciting for us as singers was finally getting together, I think in September last year, for the sort of launch of this CD, launch, I guess, in inverted commas, here at Constantia, where they've been so great and supportive of our work, coming together in the spring sunshine with a glass of wine and connecting with each other after just being behind our Zoom screens for 6 months. So where to next for VOX? And I'll sort of mention that over the next couple of slides, but for now we're continuing with not weekly anymore, but monthly Zoom gatherings, just checking in to see that everyone is doing okay. There are opportunities, as I've mentioned just before this talk, for singers to go on walks together or come together and sing, just a handful of them if they're feeling comfortable enough to do so. But when we come together as VOX, again, we'll have to do it in a way that's safe, responsible, and inclusive. We don't want to organize something where people feel that they are left out because maybe they're uncomfortable with meeting or coming together. As you can see, we have quite a a large range of people and ages, and so we need to be sensitive to that when we decide we want to come together again. But I think we have learned some valuable lessons from the lockdown. We found new ways of making music together. I think the future will see some hybrid way of rehearsing and performing. We found it very useful, for example, to come together on Zoom for at least one session when learning a new piece of music, to focus on the text associated with that piece of music, to listen to various recordings and interpretations in a very focused way. That's something we might not do if we just came together in person, where immediately we'd focus on singing together. And we need to think carefully about how much of an appetite for live choral music there's really going to be. Will people want to come out to a concert that's potentially in a very confined or intimate space? How comfortable will they feel? So we're thinking about unusual places, spaces to present our music, preferably outdoors, maybe somewhere like a quarry. There are many quarries around Cape Town, and that provides a natural amphitheatre-like space. That could be quite an exciting place to present music. And we just need to be careful about the public health situation over the next few months as the vaccine rollout happens, variants and subsequent waves of the coronavirus. We just need to be sensible and flexible. So perhaps just to end off with a few reflections of VOX and its sort of 5-year journey, but with especially this last year of there and now almost back again to where we were, but with this very interesting detour through doing things virtually. For me, one of the main focuses of VOX has always been the musical family, or the ecosystem we've created, not only with our singers, but with our audience, with other musicians, with artists, with the venues with whom we work. And consequently, we have a responsibility in this time not to put them at risk. It's a bit of a balancing act. We're so desperate, some of us, to come together, but maybe that's not the wisest thing at the moment. But still, in this time, being able to offer a musical outlet, creative works that we can keep the musicians and singers excited and inspired, and also to let our audience know that we haven't forgotten about them. And we've tried to, in this time, also reach out to other musicians, sound engineers, the artists with whom we've worked. We've recently established a relationship with the Hout Bay Music Project to involve them in our projects and to see if there are ways we can support one another during this sort of fragile time. Something that's come up again and again in this presentation, which is maybe worthy of a presentation in its own right, is talking about how one deals with a range of ages, musical experience, repertoire with an ensemble like VOX. It's very different in a university choir setting. When I worked with the University of Cape Town Choir for several years, where everyone immediately has something in common. They're a student at UCT, they're from a similar age range. It's in a way immediately more easy to form a cohesive sound. That's why we've put so much emphasis on social aspects, on coming together, on allowing the singers to get to know one another, because that surely helps with the cohesion of the sound, and then the enthusiasm also for taking risks and being a little more daring. And also in the repertoire we do, I like to be very focused in what we do for every concert, the repertoire specifically chosen for that performance. And it's not like the kind of variety show we might have had with the UCT choir, where we start off with something with a madrigal and end up with something jazzy on the other side of the musical spectrum. And this kind of brings in a tension that we often feel as VOX between live performances and recordings. Of course, if one wants to record music, it's almost a whole different type of preparation from a live performance, which has a very important visual and staging aspect to it. You can maybe get away with a lot more in a live performance. You can't necessarily get away with that in recording. And because we have this great opportunity with Cape Town Sound to make and share our recordings, how much time do we devote to the live performance, which really is our key focus, versus then spending additional time fine-tuning the music for recordings? And so that's a little bit of a tension. Sometimes we want to move on to the next performance, but we actually need to spend a little bit of time more time on the music, even though we might not perform it again, but getting it just right for the recording studio. I hope we found a musical niche, one that keeps our audience and our singers on their toes. And sometimes it's a bit uncomfortable for singers if we do things that maybe they're not familiar with, musical styles, ways of presenting music, standing on the stage. And so we really need to convince the singers that this is a musical journey worth going on. And the same with our audience. If it's music that's a little bit off their beaten track, or ways of presenting the music that they're not entirely familiar with, we need to create a comfortable, sort of safe space, but still keep them just a little bit on the edge, a little bit uncomfortable. I think that's when the most exciting and memorable musical performances really happen. And so, of course, it is difficult to please everyone, to find a one size fits all. And so something we'd like to try, and I guess our experiment now with VOX over the next year or two, is to try running it as a project choir ensemble rather than a group who meets from week to week. So instead of having in excess of 10 performances a year, just one or two major focused performances, and the singers can choose whether or not they want to sign up just for those specific performances or whether they'd sort of like to give this one a break and sign up for the next one. And then we have focused rehearsal time, a few performances, maybe a recording, and then that's that project wrapped up. And then we move on a few months later to something quite different. And I hope that's also going to give us a lot more flexibility in the kind of music we can do, and also really focus on the preparation, which otherwise with our busy performance schedule in the past has always felt a little bit rushed. And so I'd like to leave you just with one final recording. And when VOX first started about 5 years ago, one of the locations I'd always had in mind for a performance was SALT, the South African Large Telescope in Sutherland. And as a scientist, as Caroline mentioned at the beginning, I've always had this interest in combining sort of music and the sciences, maybe bring science more into our performances. And that's an interesting idea as we go into the future. But for one of these virtual projects we did last year, we did this beautiful piece of music by Erik Eschenwalds. He's a Latvian composer called Stars. And we teamed up with colleagues from the South African Astronomical Observatory who gave us access to a whole lot of wonderful celestial footage recorded right here in South Africa. And we then designed a video to accompany the virtual recording we made of this piece. And you'll notice it has a very unusual sound or timbre to it in the background. Those are tuned wine glasses that give the music a very celestial and ethereal feeling. So this is Stars by Erik Eschenwalds. Stars by Eric Essenwalds, and here are the faces of some of the voices who make this happen. So thank you all for your kind attention, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. I see that we have a message from one of our committee members who wrote, "Thank you for beautiful music and lovely footage on this Monday morning." And I must add to that, and a wonderful, excellent presentation. I don't know if we have any questions. I don't see any in the chat box, but there may be some people that want to ask you questions now.
John Gert here.
Hi, Gert.
You obviously spend a lot of time on the social interaction of your members. And I think it's probably very important now in this lockdown period to do that in order to keep them together. Have you been able to keep them all together, or have some of them fallen away?
Yeah, great point. And I meant to mention that earlier. Indeed, I mean, the best we can do is just offer the opportunity for singers to come together. And we've been very lucky that of our sort of 30 singers, maybe about 27, 28 have stayed with us. Some elected not to participate in the virtual projects. But it really depends. And, you know, they'll cite maybe their music teachers, and they spend their whole days in front of Zoom. So the last thing they want to do is get home and spend some more time in front of Zoom. But it depends. We have singers who contribute to the virtual projects but don't come to the socials, and those who are excited about the social events and maybe don't have the energy or interest to participate in the musical events. So we just try to create that environment, and then those who want to participate in what they can do. We're lucky with the virtual performances in that, let's say we only have a couple of tenors who sign up for a project. That's not the end of the world, because if they record themselves several times over, we can then create the effect of many more of that particular voice part. So it's not like a live performance where one might be hamstrung if one is missing a particular number of singers. But we've tried to be caring, create those opportunities and environments. But it is a bit of a source of tension as well, if I may just say from my side as a sort of musical director. And that's why this year I want to think quite carefully about VOX. And I've mentioned the monthly gatherings we continue to have, maybe thinking about coming together for an outside performance, maybe having specific projects rather than a continuous musical program, because there is almost a danger that it becomes too sociable and not focused enough on the music and the effort and energy that preparing a musical performance requires. So that is a balance one needs to find, but we're very lucky. I'm also fortunate to have many colleagues who really help sort of promote either the social side or the musical side now and then. And we always seem to get a critical mass of singers we need while not leaving anybody behind.
Most uplifting and really wonderful what so many of you have been able to do during this very, very difficult time. So well done. And thank you for beautiful music and an uplifting message. And so proud of what you're doing. It's wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming to share it with us today.
It's a great pleasure, Letitia. Thank you for your words. And I mean, Caroline has also been such an important part of this journey. We had a great correspondence going through the beginning of lockdown. And remember, Caroline, we'd send each other these virtual choir videos as they were coming out sort of thick and fast in the first few months of the lockdown last year. So it's really been wonderful to connect with you and now U3A over this time. And we're all in this together and learning and trying to figure out, gosh, now how do we get back to a new normal in a way, coming together and singing together. So thanks for your appreciative words.
John, can I tell you that in the chat box there is a message from Kitty Fadluddin saying, I enjoyed this very much and have learned a lot, love the lullabies particularly. And you might be interested to know that Kitty Fadluddin is someone that I interviewed for a presentation last year. She is a colleague of mine over many years from Sierra Leone.
Gosh.
And people became so interested in the work that she does with her Balanta Music Academy in Freetown. And she so enjoyed being part of it that she has now joined up regularly with us, with our U3A. So you don't only have people in the Hermanus area listening this morning, you've got someone listening all the way from Freetown in Sierra Leone.
Fantastic. Thank you for passing on that message, Caroline. Gosh, how special. Excellent.
Congratulations on such a right-brained experience from a chemical engineer. I think it's amazing that you've managed to span the whole brain there. Doctor, last week, Barry from Pretoria was saying how difficult it is to sing in the open air. And I just wondered how that fits with your plan of social distancing as one goes forward. And I think your stars at the end is just incredible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Yeah, great question. And I mean, first prize would be to sing outdoors because it's safe. And in the case of a respiratory virus like SARS-CoV-2, you want to be in a well-ventilated, large space, which is why we previously met, we put together a carols virtual choir project in December. And I mentioned just before this talk, when we were having a conversation, we did in fact meet for a few masked, distanced, face-to-face gatherings, but those were in a church building, which I guess satisfied at least those criteria of sort of being in a large space. But yes, singing outside is so difficult because the sound just disappears. And one of the pleasures of singing together is really quite literally almost feeling the sound waves that are being generated by those singers around you. And that's one thing when you're in a confined space, but when you're outdoors, all those vibrations just get lost and absorbed. So it's a difficult tension because a lot of the singers say, well, yes, why don't we get together and have an outdoor performance? But it's difficult. It's not, you know, it's not quite as musically satisfying. It would be difficult, perhaps, I think, for an audience in terms of projection. If you have the singers sort of spread out, they've got to hear one another. The sound needs to carry. If there's just a breeze or a little bit of wind, you can imagine how that would sort of upend things. So that's why I mentioned earlier, maybe this quarry idea, where at least that's kind of a natural sort of amphitheater where you have a solid surface behind you to sort of reflect some of the sound forward. And maybe we can find ways of doing a sort of best of both or some kind of overhang to also help contain the sound a bit. But it is challenging because I think the best musical and sound experiences happen indoors, but that's a very difficult place to be from a health point of view at the moment. So can we find a balance between a large, more outdoor-like space while still a satisfying musical experience from both the singers and the audience perspective?
Does the virtual world offer any acoustic assistance to you?
What do you mean by that?
The fact that you're having to use technology now as you do it, let's say on Zoom, are there abilities there to try and make the sound more that of the cathedral than of the sky?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we encourage the singers when they record at home to record in as dry acoustic as possible, so that the sound is really just sort of as plain and simple. And then we pull it all into the editing program and start to balance the voices, get the relative sound volumes right. And there's a lot one can play with in terms of whose voices are more sort of dominant. Maybe you want a more idiosyncratic or strident voice to be a little bit less obvious than a more pleasant or well sort of blending voice. And then you can do all sorts of things with reverb and acoustics, and it depends on all kinds of things. So in the stars piece I just played you, for example, we did add quite a bit of reverb there to create a sense of space and venue. It would have sounded very bland and clinical had no reverb been added. So there are ways of getting around that. I mean, it's difficult still to imagine how to apply that to a live performance setting. I suppose if you were singing outside, you could mic the choir up and in real time add a bit of a reverb to the audience, but that's an artificial way of doing it that I think would be not really acceptable to our musical ears or palates. It's one thing if the project is entirely online to take advantage of the technology available to you to make the best possible product while still being fairly true to the original sound and the intention. But now it gets a bit more complicated maybe when we talk about mixing technologies, going outside, giving a live performance, but maybe wanting to give it a slightly artificial acoustic. but it's something that's worth exploring, and maybe there is a sweet spot or a middle ground we'd be able to find.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thanks, Mick.
John, we've had one question come in the chat box. Who was the composer of that wonderful Bye Bye Lullaby?
Right, that was Stephen Carletti. He currently teaches at Bishop's, which is how we got to know one another. He teaches voice and composition there, and he's composed some marvelous choral music. We used to sing a lot of it at school, and we've kept up a correspondence over the years. He's been a great supporter of VOX, and he wrote this carol about 2 years ago and said, I've just finished this carol. Would VOX be willing to give voice to the first performance? And so it was a great privilege to be able to do that. It's a pity that I think Stephen's works are not more widely recorded and distributed, but maybe that's something we as VOX can work on, is really creating a bit more of a database almost of local composers and their choral music.
Thank you, John. And I'm so grateful that people who didn't hear you when you did a presentation for Fine Arts, or who didn't hear you when you gave a live concert for us at the Hermanus Music Society, have now had the pleasure of learning more about you and more about VOX. And thank you so much indeed. Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.